Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe to the channel to stay updated with our latest stories. Lena stood in the kitchen, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound in a house once filled with laughter. The steam from her untouched coffee curled upward like a ghost of something long forgotten. It had been 10 years with Omar, 10 years of routines, of checklists, of shared spaces that no longer felt shared. Mornings were quiet, almost sterile. They exchanged polite words like colleagues, not lovers. He worked late. She made dinner. They went to bed facing opposite walls. There was no betrayal, no explosive fights, just silence. A slow erosion. Lena had once been fire and wildness, a woman who danced barefoot in the rain and believed in midnight kisses. Now, she was the keeper of calendars and grocery lists, her dreams buried beneath laundry piles. She couldn't remember the last time Omar looked at her like she was anything more than familiar. The worst part wasn't the distance, it was the dull ache of being unnoticed. Of fading in a room where she used to shine. That morning, as sunlight spilled across the floor and her coffee went cold, Lena asked herself the question that had been clawing at the edges of her mind for months. Is this it? It began as something simple, almost innocent. Lena joined the gym at the corner of their street after months of feeling drained, invisible, and oddly restless. Omar, ever the practical husband, encouraged her with a distracted nod and "that's great," before returning to his laptop. She signed up for a beginner strength program, thinking it would help her find a rhythm again, if not in life, then at least in movement. That's where she met Ethan. From the moment she stepped into the buzzing room of clinking weights and mirrored walls, he noticed her, not with the kind of gaze that made her uncomfortable, but with an attentiveness she hadn't experienced in years. He corrected her posture gently, encouraged her when she doubted herself, and smiled with a warmth that reached his eyes. It's not about perfection, he told her on their third session. It's about reclaiming something you thought you lost. His words stirred something deep in her, something that made her throat tighten. Over time, their conversations stretched beyond fitness. They talked about music, about dreams, about what made people feel alive. Ethan listened, truly listened, without judgment, without expectation. Lena hadn't realized how much she missed being seen until it was offered to her without asking. With every interaction, she felt a flicker of something returning, not lust or infatuation, but a hunger for herself. Not for Ethan, but for the version of Lena she had lost somewhere between routines and the quiet disconnection of marriage. And that realization terrified her most of all. Lena hadn't meant for her thoughts to drift toward Ethan outside the gym, but they did, with a quiet persistence that unnerved her. At first it was harmless, a memory of his laugh echoing as she struggled to complete her last set, or the way his hand lightly brushed her shoulder to correct her form. But soon, she found herself lingering in front of the mirror before her workouts, adjusting her hair, second-guessing her leggings. She told herself it was just about motivation, a renewed sense of self. But deep down, she knew it was more. Her heartbeat betrayed her every time he looked at her a second too long. Conversations once grounded in fitness now tiptoed into vulnerability. One afternoon, after a particularly intense session, they sat on a bench outside the gym, sipping water as dusk painted the sky in lavender tones. "You seem distant today," Ethan said, not with curiosity, but concern. Lena looked at him and, for a moment, forgot the weight of her rings. "I feel invisible," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like I've become a version of myself I don't recognize." Ethan's response was quiet, but it pierced through her walls. "Maybe it's time you remembered who you were before the world told you who to be." The air between them stilled, thick with something unspoken. In that moment, Lena realized this wasn't just a distraction, it was the first time in years someone had looked at her and truly seen her. And that was dangerous. The night Lena invited Ethan for coffee was not planned. It wasn't some calculated rebellion or secret flirtation. It was instinct, a quiet longing that whispered louder than her conscience. The gym had emptied, the lights dimmed, and the city breathed in slow pulses beyond the windows. She had lingered longer than usual, packing her things with deliberate slowness. Ethan was at the front desk, scrolling through something on his phone when she blurted, "Do you have time for coffee?" He looked up, surprised, then smiled, soft, warm, familiar. "Yes, sure," he said, as if he'd been waiting for the question all along. They found a small corner cafe down the block, the kind with dim lighting and rain-speckled windows. Their conversation, which began with casual banter, unraveled quickly into something more intimate. Lena hadn't spoken this freely in years. She told Ethan about her marriage to Omar, the slow erosion of connection, the comfortable silence that had turned suffocating, and the growing ache inside her. Ethan didn't interrupt. He didn't judge. He simply listened, eyes locked on hers like she was the only person in the world worth hearing. "You deserve to feel alive," he said at one point, and Lena nearly dropped her mug. Because deep down, she had forgotten that. Forgotten what it felt like to be seen, to be heard, to matter. When he said it, it didn't sound like a temptation, it sounded like truth. And as they sat across from each other, the tension between them thickened into something undeniable. Something neither of them dared name. The night Omar told Lena about his upcoming work trip, she stood at the sink washing dishes, water running over her fingers like a distraction from the numbness spreading inside her. "It's just a 3-day conference," he said casually from the dining table, not even looking up from his laptop. "I'll be back Sunday." She nodded, offered a quiet okay, and turned her face toward the window so he wouldn't see the flicker of something else cross her expression. It wasn't sadness or worry. It was a whisper of possibility, an echo of freedom. That weekend, their apartment felt unusually quiet. The silence wasn't new, but now it stretched and swelled, no longer just absence, it was awareness. Lena went to the gym, as usual, but when she saw Ethan across the floor, something inside her shifted. There was no workout plan that day, no talk of sets or form. She stayed after class, lingering again. When he approached, his brow slightly furrowed with concern, she didn't hesitate this time. "I don't want to go home yet," she said softly. They walked through the park, dusk settling around them like a secret. And as they strolled beneath the rustling canopy of trees, Lena admitted what she hadn't dared voice before, "I feel like I'm disappearing." Ethan stopped walking. "You're not invisible, Lena. You've just forgotten how bright you shine." She looked up at him, heart pounding. And in that moment, she realized she didn't want to be seen as someone's wife. She wanted to be seen as herself. Lena lay awake that night, the hum of the ceiling fan a steady rhythm above her as moonlight crept through the blinds, casting thin silver lines across the bed. The side Omar had slept on for years remained untouched, but it wasn't just his absence she felt, it was the echo of something deeper, something missing long before he packed his suitcase. Her thoughts drifted to Ethan, the warmth of his gaze, the weight of his words, the unspoken tenderness that had passed between them during that quiet walk through the park. It wasn't just attraction. It was recognition. A feeling she hadn't experienced in years, the sense that someone saw her, not for the role she filled, but for the woman she truly was. The next morning, Lena found herself standing in front of the gym mirror, not studying her form, but her reflection. Who had she become? When had she stopped dreaming, stopped feeling? Ethan didn't ask anything from her, he offered no promises, no expectations. Yet every time they spoke, he lit a match inside her, illuminating the forgotten corners of her soul. As the day wore on, she couldn't shake the tension coiling beneath her skin. She tried to read, clean, even nap, but her thoughts were relentless. And then came the text from Ethan, "You okay?" 3 words. That was all it took. Lena's fingers hovered over her phone, trembling. "Can we talk?" She typed back. Because sometimes the most dangerous moment isn't the one you regret, it's the one you can't stop thinking about. The rain drummed softly against the cafe window, a rhythmic whisper that mirrored the storm brewing inside Lena. She sat across from Ethan, hands wrapped around a warm mug she hadn't sipped from in minutes. The cozy corner of the cafe had become their quiet escape, a bubble where time slowed and the outside world felt less real. But today was different. The air between them was heavy, not with guilt, but with anticipation. Ethan leaned back slightly, watching her with that quiet intensity she had come to recognize. "You seem far away," he said gently. "I am," Lena replied, her voice barely above the rain. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore." Ethan didn't speak immediately. He just looked at her, truly looked, and she hated how comforting that felt. "Then maybe," he said slowly, "it's time to ask yourself what you really want. Not what you should do. Not what everyone expects. What you want." The words settled over her like a second skin. What did she want? A life of stability and numbness with Omar? Or the terrifying spark of rediscovery with Ethan, where each touch ignited a part of her she thought had died? Her phone buzzed on the table, Omar checking in from his business trip. She didn't look at it. Not yet. Instead, she met Ethan's gaze and whispered, "I don't know how to go back to who I was." He reached out, his fingers brushing hers. "Maybe you're not supposed to." And just like that, the idea of going forward didn't seem so terrifying. The storm had passed, but inside Lena, the turbulence only grew. She stood at the balcony of her apartment, the city lights flickering below her like 1,000 temptations. Omar was returning the next morning, and the thought of facing him felt like stepping back into a world that no longer fit. The life they had built, once vibrant and full of promise, now felt like a glass shell, pretty from a distance, but hollow when tapped. Ethan's voice still echoed in her mind, not his words, but the way he said them, gentle, sincere, like he saw through her layers and touched the raw truth beneath. That evening, Lena found herself walking to the gym, not for a workout, but for something she couldn't quite name. Ethan was there alone, wiping down equipment, surprised to see her but saying nothing. She walked up to him and simply said, "I couldn't sleep." He nodded, understanding without needing to ask. They didn't speak much. Instead, they sat on the edge of the training mat, shoulders brushing, hearts thudding in sync. And then, in the quiet of that empty space, Lena asked the question that had haunted her for days. "What happens if I want more?" Ethan turned to her, his gaze steady. "Te. But only if you're ready to live with what comes after." It wasn't a promise. It wasn't even a dare. It was a door, one she had to choose to walk through. And for the first time in years, she wanted to. Lena stood in her kitchen, hands trembling slightly as she stirred the simmering pot on the stove. Omar was due home in an hour, and everything felt rehearsed: the dinner, the smile she practiced in the mirror, the conversation she had mentally scripted. But no amount of seasoning could mask the bitterness that had seeped into her life. She had always been the woman who kept things together, who smiled through disappointment and swallowed her own needs for the sake of peace. But now, her silence felt suffocating. Ethan had unraveled something in her, something raw, restless, and impossible to ignore. That afternoon, she'd received a message from Ethan. "Just checking in. I hope you're okay." Short. Simple. But it hit her like a wave. It wasn't the words, it was the care. A kind of presence she hadn't felt in years. She hadn't replied. She couldn't. Not while still pretending to be the wife Omar believed her to be. Yet, as she stood there in the golden hour light, watching her reflection in the kitchen window, Lena couldn't help but question everything. Was she still the same woman who once felt fulfilled in this life? Or had she outgrown the version of herself that made peace with emotional starvation? The door opened. Omar's voice called out. "Smells amazing, Lena." She turned, smiled, and kissed his cheek. But inside, the storm raged louder. Because even in that quiet domestic moment, her mind was elsewhere, on a park bench, under a dusky sky, beside a man who made her feel seen. The night Omar left for his weekend business trip, Lena found herself standing at the threshold of a choice she had been silently approaching for weeks. The apartment felt larger than usual, the silence echoing off the walls like a question she didn't want to answer. She told herself she'd catch up on rest, maybe clean, maybe journal, but instead, she found her fingers scrolling through her phone, hovering over Ethan's name. It wasn't premeditated. At least, that's what she told herself. When she typed out, "Are you still at the gym?" and hit send, she knew the lie had already begun to dissolve. Ethan's reply came quickly. "Yes. Come by if you want to talk." No pressure. No assumption. Just space. Space Lena hadn't had in so long. She arrived at the gym an hour later, her heart pounding in rhythm with the rain outside. Ethan greeted her not with words, but with a gaze that made her feel completely present. They didn't speak much at first, just sat side by side on the empty workout mats, listening to the soft hum of the city outside. And then, slowly, the conversation unfurled. Dreams. Disappointments. Quiet confessions. When Ethan reached for her hand, Lena didn't pull away. His touch wasn't demanding, it was grounding. Safe. Yet thrilling. The kind of contact that speaks to a part of the soul long neglected. It wasn't a kiss. Not yet. But in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. A door quietly opened, and Lena, trembling, didn't close it. The The days that followed were a blur of restraint and temptation. Lena moved through her routine like a shadow, present but detached. Omar returned from his trip with the same worn smile, kissed her on the forehead, and collapsed into bed without sensing the quiet storm inside her. But Lena felt it constantly, the pull of that moment in the gym, the weight of Ethan's hand, the quiet that hummed louder than words. It lingered like the scent of rain on pavement, impossible to ignore. She tried to recenter herself. Tried to be the wife she'd always been. But every time Omar touched her shoulder or reached for her hand across the dinner table, her body stiffened, unsure if it belonged to the life she had chosen or the one she was aching for. And then came the night that blurred the line further. A storm rolled in, washing the city in silver, and Lena stood at the window long after Omar had fallen asleep. Her phone buzzed softly beside her.
Are you okay?
It was from Ethan.
A simple question.
But it unhinged something. Without thinking, she replied, "Can we talk?" Minutes later she was in his car, the rain drumming gently on the roof, their breaths fogging up the windows as they sat in silence, staring ahead. And then, like gravity had been pulling them toward this moment all along, Ethan turned to her.
If he kiss you now, will you stop him?
She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Her silence said everything. The kiss was a spark in a room soaked in gasoline. One moment, Lena was trembling with hesitation, and the next, she was engulfed in a fire she hadn't realized she'd been craving. Ethan's lips on hers were soft but assured, like he'd been waiting for this, like they both had. The world outside his car faded, the storm, the guilt, the consequences. All that existed was the way her heart hammered against her chest and the heat rising from places long forgotten. Their kiss deepened, not rushed, but deliberate, filled with years of emotional starvation, with everything left unsaid. Lena knew it was wrong. She knew it would change everything. But in that moment, she didn't care. She wanted to feel, to be touched like she mattered, to be looked at with that kind of reverence. When they finally pulled apart, breathless, Ethan didn't speak. He just looked at her with that steady, unreadable gaze, the kind that didn't demand answers, only truth. Lena turned away, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the rain. "I don't know who I am anymore," she whispered, her voice breaking under the weight of her confession. Ethan reached for her hand, warm and grounding. "Maybe this is where you start finding out." And in the quiet aftermath, Lena realized the kiss hadn't just been about passion. It was a breaking point. A mirror. A crack in the carefully painted surface of her life, and now that it had formed, there was no going back. Lena stood in front of the mirror, her reflection fragmented by the golden morning light spilling through the blinds. Her fingers trembled slightly as they brushed over her lips still tingling from the kiss she'd shared with Ethan the night before. Everything had changed. Not just between her and Ethan, but inside her. The woman who once moved through life out of duty and routine had been awakened by something raw, something real. But now came the reckoning. The thrill of the moment had faded, leaving only the echo of guilt and the weight of uncertainty pressing against her chest. When Omar stepped into the room, freshly showered and humming softly to himself, Lena felt the sting of betrayal pierce her. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't inattentive. He was steady, loyal, and still she had drifted. She wanted to look him in the eye, to tell him the truth, but the words clung to her throat like thorns. Over breakfast, Omar reached across the table, brushing her hand with his. "You've seemed different lately," he said gently, his eyes searching hers. "Is everything okay?" Lena forced a smile, her insides in knots. "Just tired," she murmured. But the lie tasted bitter. She wasn't just tired, she was torn.
Bettween Komfort and Desire.
Between a past she had promised and a future she hadn't dared to imagine. And in that quiet kitchen, as her husband sipped his coffee unaware, Lena realized the hardest part wasn't the betrayal. It was choosing who she wanted to be from this point forward. In today's fast-paced world, it's easy to lose yourself in routines. Careers, responsibilities, and relationships that once brought joy can begin to feel stagnant. Lena's story is a reminder that emotional disconnection doesn't always come from dramatic events, but often from subtle neglect of our own needs. If you feel unfulfilled or distant from your partner, don't wait for things to unravel. Talk. Reflect. Reconnect. Nourish the relationship, but also tend to your own growth. Desire doesn't always mean betrayal, it may signal the need for change, healing, or rediscovery. Choose honesty, both with your partner, and most importantly, with yourself.